Hi, I'm Corolla, and on Instagram I'm at From Corolla. If you've seen my other videos, you know I love stationery and talking about the supplies that I use. This video is a bit different in that I'm going to do a real-time watercolor painting session and show you my style of floral drawing. If you follow me on Instagram at From Corolla, then you've seen that I love watercolor painting and any kind of ink painting, and I love drawing flowers. And I'd love to show that process and chat about some of my techniques and tips throughout. So after watching this video, if you're interested in seeing more, I'm hoping to do a regular draw with me session where I just chat about my process and some of the techniques that I use. So let me know in the comments if that's of interest to you. So first I'm going to talk about some of the supplies that I use. In this video I'm using the Galen Leather A5 Everyday Pad, which is made of Tomoe River paper. Underneath the paper I have a blotting sheet which is made of leather, but you can use any blotting paper or a cardboard piece of paper, and it's just to not let the water soak through. And in terms of watercolor paints, I mean everyone has this pan that is probably from Michael's or your craft store. But the paints that I really like are made by Beam Paints, which is an Indigenous female-owned company located in Manitoulin Island in Ontario, Canada. And they make these plastic-free paints that either sit in wood pieces or they're in these paper pieces, and they use no plastic, they're waste-free, and vibrant colors, so I love them. In terms of storing my paints, I usually have them in a cardboard box, or if I'm on the go, I reuse this Kaweco fountain pen tin, and I can just throw in some paint stones and a eyedropper to transfer water. I have this travel brush, which is also from Beam Paints. It's the number 4, which I use for most of my paintings because it's so versatile. And I also have a sponge, and then, you know, I include little tidbits in this tin, and it's super easy to carry around with me wherever I go. If you're familiar with HOBONICHI products, then you'll probably recognize this small drawer pouch. I put travel cards and samples in here so that I can have them ready to go if I'm on the go and I want to do a little bit of painting. These travel cards are super handy to have. They have paint dots inside. You just add a little bit of water and you have paint, and they last for quite a while. I also have little samples in here, and so I can try different types of paints and different colors. And I also do swatches so I know what paints I have. These paint brushes hold water inside the reservoir, and they're from Tombow, and there's 3 different types of nibs. Super easy to use. This is a water spritzer, so if you need to activate your paint just by spritzing a little bit of water, an eyedropper to transfer some water onto the watercolor travel cards, and then just a bunch of brushes, so different sizes. Most of them are fine tips because I like to do small watercolor pieces if I'm on the go. But yeah, so this travel pouch carries a lot of things inside, and I can have everything with me on the go. On top of the watercolor, I like to draw flowers, which you'll see in my process. And my favorite go-to pen is the Mono Drawing Pen by Tombow in 01 size. I also use 02. And I keep 2 jars of water. One is for clean water, one is the dirty water, and I try not to drink out of the jars. And I use ceramic plates to mix my palette or try out different colors that I might want to use in my painting. So those are the usual supplies that I use. Now I'm going to show you my process from start to finish. So for this watercolor piece, I'm using the number 4 round brush from Beam Paints, and I'm also using a paper towel, which you'll find is super handy to have beside you for watercolor painting, for dabbing, or just getting a little bit of the ink off. And I also use a little piece of watercolor paper just to sometimes swatch, or if I'm not sure about the color, I can test it on there. I also use an eyedropper just to drop some water on top of the paint to activate it. And if it dries out while I'm painting, I usually just grab the eyedropper and some clean water and drop some water on top of the paint. I usually grab some of the paint and add it to my ceramic plate so that I could mix paints with it if I want to, or I also add water to that paint on the plate to play around with the value. So that means if I add a little bit more water to it, it's a lighter value and a lighter shade on the paper. If I take it directly from the paint stone itself, then I have a darker value and a darker shade on the paper. So the rest of this video is pretty much me painting and talking about how I started this process of painting and how I found my style, and giving some tips and techniques that I've learned over time that may help you in your watercolor journey. So you can mute me, grab your favorite drink, and just watch, or you can listen to me chat a little bit about my process and my style. So this style of painting is loose and freehand, and by loose I mean not realistic. So I don't necessarily paint actual flowers, but what I'm doing here is just painting the outlines. So those sort of mimic petals or leaves, or the general shape of flowers that I'll want to draw on top later. And it's also freehand because I'm not using a reference. I'm not looking at anything while I'm painting this. I'm just kind of going off memory of what a flower would look like in my mind. And that's why it's not realistic, because I find that what a flower looks like in our minds is not always necessarily what we tend to draw as flowers. And so I try and just keep it very free and loose in what I'm drawing. And it's kind of a free-flowing, like stream of consciousness kind of painting. It's more so a practice of mindfulness. So, you know, breathing, letting go, trusting the process, playing with paints, and letting the paint go with the flow, and letting the water sort of do what it wants to, and letting your hand guide what ends up on the paper. So not so much thinking about, you know, what should this look like and what do I want the end piece to be, but more so just, where is my next outline going to go? Where should I put my hand down and put some paint on the paper? And as you watch me draw or paint, you'll see that I'm just kind of randomly putting outlines and colors wherever, and then I'm going back and adding a little bit more color where my eye thinks there should be more color. Not necessarily painting flowers, but painting the outlines of flowers and adding color as I go. Instead of focusing on the object itself, like the flower itself, I'm thinking more about the composition of the piece as a whole. So seeing how all the outlines sort of look on this piece of paper. And what I like to employ is the rule of thirds, which is breaking up the piece of paper into quadrants or thirds, and placing the outlines along those lines. And that makes it look a little bit better to the eye. And I also like to draw an odd number of flowers. Sometimes I don't, because I'm actually not like counting all of them, but I tend to draw odd flowers because it just looks better composed that way. I also focus on color distribution and the balance of colors on the piece. So when I go with the different colors that I've chosen, I make sure that I distribute it evenly throughout the piece and not just, you know, in one side of the paper or in one block. And then I also look at the size of the different outlines. So I have like small outline pieces and larger pieces, just so that it doesn't look like, you know, big blobs everywhere, but more so like small, medium, large blobs or flower outlines. And you can see that my strokes tend to be very light. I don't put a lot of paint on the paper, and maybe it's because of the paper that I'm using. So Tomoe River paper is fountain pen friendly. So what that means is you can use inks on it, and it will hold the ink really well without bleeding through the page onto the next page. And so I found that it's actually really friendly to watercolor as well, but you can't use too much water on this type of paper because it will soak through to the other side. It's not watercolor specific paper. So if you want to use a lot of water and experiment that way, then, you know, go right ahead. But I would probably recommend getting specific paper, so watercolor paper for that. And I do like using Tomoe River paper because it has this crinkly texture, and if that bothers you, then I probably would tell you not to use Tomoe River paper because it will have this crinkly sort of warped feeling to it afterwards. And what I'm doing now is just, I finished sort of the main piece, the main colors that I wanted in this piece. Now I'm going in with some leaf outlines. So drawing some leaves in, but making them more of an outline, so they're kind of this basic shape of a leaf. And I'll draw them in later, as you'll see. But I use different shades of green. I start with a light usually, and then I go into dark because if you start with dark, then it's hard to lighten it up. But if you use a light color first, then you can always darken it. You can always add layers of colors on top of it to give it a little bit of depth. And so that's what I'm doing now, just distributing this green throughout and making it look even and adding a little bit of filler as well. So where I see a lot of white space, I will either add support flowers or little flowers, or the easiest way of filling up that white space is to add leaves. You'll notice that there are other paints on the ceramic plate already, and it's because every time I watercolor, I add paints to this plate, and then I leave it there, and then I reactivate it when I add more water and more paints the next time. And I kind of love this, that the colors get sort of their own shades, and they evolve as I add more colors on top of them. And they are one of a kind. Like it's hard to sort of recreate some of these colors again, and maybe I could if I tried to really pinpoint what the shade was. But I like that the colors change over time and they're never really exactly the same, and that's what keeps it interesting for me and exciting. And like I said, this is freehand and loose, so it doesn't have to be a realistic leaf color or realistic flower color. It just has to work together, and it just has to look good to your eye. So I'm just kind of having fun with this and adding colors as I go, and then I darken or lighten different colors, shades, and add them on top, or just to kind of fill out the white space. Now here's where I tend to step back and take a look at the overall piece again and decide, you know, am I done with this, or do I add a little bit more? And, you know, it just depends. So sometimes, you know, I'll stop here and then I'll move on. And it kind of depends on how much time I have as well, because I don't want to take up too much time painting. Because the next part is drawing on top, and I want this to kind of dry and have the time to set. So sometimes I'll look at it and think, okay, I kind of want darker tones, and that's why I'm kind of adding this darker green on top. But you know, it does depend. Sometimes I'm having so much fun playing with a watercolor that I don't want to stop. And maybe that's you know, going back to when you're an artist or a painter or a drawer or a writer, you just keep going because you love the process. And when I paint, I do have to trust in the process. So I'll know when it's time to stop. Just as, you know, when you get to a point when you feel done, that's when it's time to move on to the next phase. Now I'm finally done my watercolor piece, so it's time to clean off that brush and put it aside. And this is when I take a look at what I created. I went with a flow and just painted flower outlines, freehand and loose. And as you can see, the paper is crinkly. It did a really good job of not bleeding through, which is what I love about this paper. And the blotting paper really helped from keeping the water from seeping through. I'll just wait until the paint dries and then I'll draw with ink on top of it. So I actually went back and I added a little bit of gold to the piece just to give it a little bit more interest. So adding a little bit of water straight to the paint and then dabbing it and adding it to the center, or where I think sort of where the center of the flower would be. And that will help guide me when I'm drawing the actual flowers on top. And then adding a little bit of gold along the lines of the leaves, giving them some highlight or just some shine. Now that the paint is dry, you can see the shine and the shimmer and the different shades of the paint that I put down earlier. This next part is super fun and a practice in going with the flow, not being perfect, but embracing imperfection of drawing flowers. For this next part, I'm going to use a fine liner. My go-to is a Tombow Mono Drawing Pen 02 or 01. And I would say use any fine liner because they're fast drying and so you don't have to worry too much about smudging. But you know, use any pen or pencil that you have on hand that you're comfortable using. I'm also a Tombow ambassador, so I love Tombow products. If you want to try these fine liners, then you can use the code and link that's in my description. So for this piece, I'm just kind of eyeballing the different outlines that I've already painted. And this is what's going to guide me in terms of where the flowers will kind of be. And it's not an exact piece, so it's not like I'm using a reference. I can always change it up if I want to. The pen will sort of guide me in terms of what I want to draw and where I want to draw it, and that's the beauty of it. This part can be scary because you have this watercolor piece and it looks great and you can just walk away, but you know, that's not my style. And I've pushed myself and learned to embrace that scary feeling, that feeling where you're like, oh no, am I gonna mess this up? And the only really way to get over that feeling is to embrace it, to accept it, and to say, I'm just gonna trust the process, I'm gonna trust myself, and this is just art, it's fun. Whatever it ends up looking like, you're going to have fun doing it. And that's what matters. So I just put the fine liner to paper and I start. And this may help you when you're looking at a piece and you don't know where to start. I would start with the leaves because the leaves are so easy. They are just a simple shape and you don't have to make them intricate. People will look at them and say, oh, those are leaves because they're green and they're a certain shape. And then I move on to the flowers and I just tackle one at a time. So I'll draw petals and then I'll draw the center, seeds, and then I'll draw some directional lines. And that's just to kind of guide my eye and the viewer's eye to show which way the petals are pointing or facing, because it's kind of hard to tell sometimes. And if you look at flowers in a natural setting, petals are facing everywhere, you know, and they can be falling off and they can be facing downwards or inwards or upwards. And so I like to draw them in different directions, and just have lines to show which way they're facing or pointing. And that's kind of an easy trick to filling in or helping the eye fill in what it might miss otherwise. My tip here when you're drawing loose flowers is to not grip the pen too tightly, to hold it loosely and let it guide you. So I don't think too much about the flower itself, or you know, what kind of flower I'm drawing, because it's loose. It's not meant to be a realistic flower. But I have found over time, and the more I practice, that I like to draw certain types of petals, and it's probably a certain type of flower in the end, but I'm not exactly sure what kind. But you'll find that there are certain types of leaf shapes or flower shapes that just look better to you and are just so much easier to draw. And because this is a practice of mindfulness, of just letting go and letting your hand draw what it wants to and enjoying it, I find this so relaxing. And instead of focusing on the object itself, so the flower, I'm thinking more about keeping the pen moving, letting my hand guide the pen, and just drawing whatever comes to mind in terms of petals and leaves and lines, and just trusting it. When I first learned how to draw flowers and the different types of flowers, I would draw really slowly, and I found that I would just obsess about whether it looked realistic or not. And that's kind of how I found my style. Is I just got so tired of not being able to draw certain types of flowers, and I thought, you know what, I love drawing flowers. I love the floral shape, and I love leaves and bouquets, but man, I don't know how to draw all types of flowers. And I've learned that it's okay. It's okay not to know how to draw flowers and make them look realistic. But if you love drawing flowers and you love bouquets and you want to capture them in a creative way, then this is a style that has worked for me, and that's why I want to share it, because you might try it and think, you know, this is my way of drawing as well. Like, this is so much easier and there's less pressure, I think, because it doesn't have to look like a bouquet, and it doesn't have to look like all these different types of flowers. You can just draw one type or style of flower over and over again if you want, and this piece kind of does. And sometimes I actually do. I just draw the same types of petals over and over. But in the end, it's practice, and it's still creative, and it's still art, and it's going to look great, and it's going to be your style. So don't put too much pressure on yourself to draw flowers if you feel like you can't, because you can find a style all of your own that you can still enjoy drawing flowers if you want, and it'll still look great. So as you can see, I'm not drawing too slowly, but I am kind of taking my time to work through the piece. So because I'm right-handed, I tend to draw from left to right, just so I'm not smudging things that I've already drawn. And this is kind of an easy way for me to draw it, but at the same time, you know, sometimes I start at the top and I go down, or I start from the bottom and go up, and I like to switch it up a little bit. And that's probably why it's good to use a fine liner, because they dry quickly. And that's it. That's the final piece. So if you put me on mute or you skipped ahead, that's okay. What I talked about was playing with color, playing with value and the different shades, adding a little bit of gold on top to add interest. And then after the paint dried, just drawing loose flowers, going freehand on top with a fine liner. And as you can see, the paper is a little bit crinkly, which I actually love that texture, but it didn't bleed through to the other side. And that's why I like using Tomoe River paper to watercolor and draw on. I hope watching my process of watercolor painting and then drawing flowers freehand on top was interesting in some way, or that you picked up some tips, or that it inspired you to try your own style. I'll see you in a future video, and in the meantime, you can chat with me on Instagram at @FromCorolla, or you can leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!